So for those of you who just joined, I'm Sue Ostoff with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, and I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you and to thank you for joining us today. As I said to Donna earlier, I am just so thrilled that so many people are interested in this topic and really appreciate how many of you have joined us today. And just before we go any further, I want to just take a second to thank the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for their support of this webinar. And I want to give a special shout out to the people from the FIPSA office at the Administration for Children and Families Division who are participating today. We just think it's so great they're supporting this very important work. We also want to acknowledge our partners at the Office on Violence Against Women as well, some of whom are also on today's webinar. So thanks so much. You've probably noticed all the participants are muted. As I mentioned earlier, we will collect questions during the presentation, and I'll ask as many as we can at the end of the webinar. We plan to leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So as you're probably aware, today's webinar is titled, Why Opposing Hyper Incarceration Should Be Central to the Work of the Anti-Domestic Violence Movement. And in an effort to save time, I'll do a very brief introduction of Donna Coker, and it's actually really hard to do because there's so much great stuff to say. When I was thinking about this, my introduction was going to be quite long, but I really want to get her speaking as soon as possible. You can read the slide here. It has some information about her amazing work. And then, as I said, we also posted her bio that has a little more information on it on Google Drive, and that link is in your email that you got earlier. You know, it's really an honor to introduce you, Donna. Donna just does so much interesting and important work, and I'm really thrilled that she's agreed to share some of her wisdom with all of us today. I mean, you can see from her bio here that she's a professor of law at the University of Miami School of Law, but that really hardly begins to tell you who Donna actually is or where she's from. I mean, interestingly, back in 1978, before she went to law school, Donna was the sole staff person at a newly opened battered women's shelter. And for 10 years, she worked as an advocate, a paralegal, and a social worker in a variety of positions in the anti-domestic violence field. And it's clear from her work that she certainly has not forgotten these very important foundational experiences. And Donna, I bet you cleaned toilets way back then, didn't you?
And emptied out freezers and yeah.
Yes.
Right.
I really feel lucky to have known Donna for such a long time, and I've always been wildly impressed with how smart she is, how extremely energetic she is, and how hard she works to bridge the world of the academy with those of us who are working in the trenches or otherwise working outside of the academy. Recently, and that was in 2014, Donna co-chaired a total kick-ass national conference called Converge, Reimagining the Movement to End Gender Violence. And I know some of you who are on the webinar today were lucky enough to be there. At this conference, Donna and others brought together just this really remarkable group of advocates, activists, and academics to think really hard about where we need to go next. And I think many of you know her recently published report, Responses from the Field, Sexual Assault, Domestic Violence, and Policing, that she co-authored with Sandra Park, Julie Goldscheid, and some others. Links to the papers from the Converge conference, the report, a link to the report I just mentioned, and this totally cool web project called Reimagining the Movement to End Gender Violence are all on Donna's bio that is posted on our Google Drive. So I highly recommend that you check them out. As I said earlier, we're so pleased to have Donna with us today. I know she has a lot to share, so I'm going to move on. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box at the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I will acknowledge that I see your questions, so if I don't acknowledge them, please repose your questions so to make sure I actually see it. So Donna, thanks so much for all your amazing work, and thank you for your willingness to share it with us today. And Donna, so now I'm going to ask you to switch over to the private tab.
I did.
Okay. We don't want her to be distracted by all you people on this webinar. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Sue, for inviting me to do this. And I have such amazing respect and admiration for the work you do. And thanks to everybody else at the National Clearinghouse. And thank you to all of you who've taken time from, I know, enormously busy schedules to have this conversation. I'm very grateful to be doing this. I know that right now the problem of mass incarceration or hyper incarceration is one that is very much in the public eye. The issues received bipartisan attention. We know the U.S. Attorney General issued new rules for federal prosecutors to diminish the reach of mandatory sentencing in drug crimes, for example. California voters passed a proposition that lowered sentences for a host of nonviolent offenses and created a process whereby people who'd been sentenced under the old regime could readjust their sentence. We've heard from President Obama about the issues of mass incarceration. And then, of course, critically important has been the tremendous activism of Black Lives Matter, Free Marissa Alexander, and many, many other organizations and organizers around the country that have focused our attention particularly on the racial bias effects in the criminal justice system. So in some ways, as I said to Sue, you already know this, right? We know this. I think as social justice activists, as human rights activists, as civil rights activists working in the movement to end gender violence, there's much of this that we do know. But I also think that it's useful to think through the connections with our work in a more systematic way than I think we ordinarily do, and to think about what those connections might mean for how we frame our work, for the decisions that we make, for the partners that we ally ourselves with, I think is really important. So at the outset, I would just note that there are really, I think, two very much related strands in this conversation. One strand is to understand the impact of mass incarceration on the people that we work with, on the incident rates of domestic violence, on the risk of domestic violence, and I'm going to focus a great deal of attention on that. And that's a somewhat narrower perspective than some of you might wish, because I think the other strand here then is to also think about whether the issues around mass incarceration should change anything about how we do our work in response to domestic violence. And so I'm hoping if the distinction between those two things isn't clear, I hope that it will be by the end of this conversation, and I want to get back to both of those strands. So this slide gives you an overview of where I'm going. I'm going to talk about rates. I'm going to explain why I prefer the term hyper incarceration to mass incarceration, the more common term. And then I'll spend a considerable amount of time talking about what I think the connections are, particularly between domestic violence, which will be largely my focus, but we can talk about sexual assault as well, and hyper incarceration. Then I want to pull the lens back and think about the larger picture, of which I think mass incarceration is a piece, and talk about that. And then finally, and importantly, what I think this means for the work we do, and openness for conversation. So with incarceration rates, we've seen this dramatic, and it's really hard to overemphasize how dramatic this rise is in the number of people incarcerated in prisons and jails. If you look at this slide, if you start looking from around 1974, you see this sharp, sharp increase. Right now we have about 2 million people in our jails and prisons, and that's about the rough equivalent of the population of Houston, Texas. We have another 5 million under the control of the criminal justice system in what many have called internal exile. That means they are unable to travel, they're unable to relocate for better economic circumstances, unable to relocate to escape an abuser, for example, because they're on community control. They're in parole or probation conditions. And then on top of that, 7 million, another roughly 35,000 any given day in our immigration detention centers. Most of you know, I suspect, that we incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. This slide's a little tough to read, but what it says, it's got the U.S. rate at the top, and this is the number per 100,000 population. It shows the U.S. at 707 per 100,000 compared to the next highest number, which is Russia, at 474 per 100,000. So we have a mass incarceration problem, but why do I use the term hyper incarceration rather than mass incarceration? I do it because I think hyper better captures two aspects of this phenomenon that I think are critically important. And here I'm drawing from Frank Rudy Cooper. One is hyper-incarceration captures the hyper nature of this, the incredible explosion in rates. This is not business as usual. What's happened from 1970 forward is unprecedented. We have never incarcerated this many people before in the history of the country. The other thing that I think hyper-incarceration captures is that the risk of incarceration and the impact of hyper-incarceration is targeted on specific groups of people. It is not evenly distributed throughout the population, which the term mass might imply, but rather African Americans, people of color, particularly African Americans, particularly poor, particularly urban communities of color have been targeted. And we'll look in a moment at the research looking at who's in prison, and again we'll see that race and class are very much factors. In fact, here we go. So race and significant class and racial disparities in these numbers. What you see is if you compare 1972 to 2010, of course you've got big increases in every category. But look at this category to the far right, that aqua-colored bar that reaches way, way up. That's the bar for African American men without a high school degree. By far the largest increase between 1972 and 2010. The incarceration rates for women have also been dramatic. In fact, increases in incarceration for women have outstripped the increases for men. There are many more men in prison than women, but the increase has been dramatic for women. It's been most dramatic for African American women. A significant reason for that increase has been drug war and drug crime responses, which has swept many, many women into prison who would not have been there in prior times. Right now, the U.S. accounts for about only 5% of the world's female population, but 30% of the incarcerated women. We've seen, and you can see this here in the women's chart, a recent decline in the numbers of people incarcerated. There are many reasons for that. One of the reasons has to do with the rollback in incarceration rates in California. The reduction in California prison rates accounts for about 57% of that total decline in incarceration rates. So you can see it's starting to level a bit here in the on the women's bar, and that's true across the board. In terms of racial disparities with women, as of 2000, African American women were incarcerated 6 times the rate of white women. But as you see from this account comparing 2000 to 2009, the racial picture is changing. So African American women are still incarcerated at far disproportionate numbers to their population, but the difference in terms of incarceration between African American women and white women is changing. African American women are being incarcerated at a lowering rate. White women incarceration rates are going up. The overall, it's important to remember, the overall incarceration rates have declined. So some of the racial disparities, the historic racial disparities, as I mentioned, are a direct result of drug war enforcement policies. Importantly, the research on racial bias in the criminal justice system finds the strongest effect of racial bias to be in drug policy and drug enforcement. In part, that's because with drug enforcement is really completely a product of policing strategy and police decision making. If you do a raid on my college campus right now, I am confident that you would find illicit drugs in those campus dorms, but we don't do raids on college campuses as a rule. Instead, policies have focused primarily on street buys. They have focused primarily in minority communities. And it's important too, and you may know this, to realize the degree to which federal dollars have pushed this kind of policy. The federal money that's available for drug control has made focusing on drug crimes a particularly attractive means of financing police departments. So why the high rates of incarceration in the U.S.? Well, I've already mentioned one, and that's the drug crime policies. And there are many ways to attack this question. Obviously, one can think about the politics. One can think about looking at mass incarceration policies as responses to civil rights gains. If you haven't read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, I highly recommend it. I also recommend Marie Gottschalk's book called Clout. Both provide excellent kind of overview of the politics of mass incarceration. I'm going to pull the lens in a little bit closer, and I'm going to talk about the actual mechanisms. In other words, I'm going to talk about the laws and policies that create mass incarceration. And then at the end, we'll come back and we'll talk about the larger picture, the political picture. So the rise in incarceration is the direct result of a series of policy decisions, longer and mandatory sentencing that remove discretion from judges and place discretion in the hands of prosecutors. When prosecutors make a charging decision, that really controls the number of years that a defendant faces. In addition to that, it's not only that it's not only that the sentencing has increased and become draconian for so many offenses. It's not only that those sentences are mandatory. It's also that a number of infractions, civil things that would have been treated as civil infractions, have become criminalized. So it's also a net widening that's happened, and I'll talk about that in a moment. There's also truth in sentencing laws, which have pretty much eliminated or gutted dramatically the ability to get parole or probation. In Florida, for example, in practically every sentence, an incarcerated person has to serve 85% of their sentence before they can get released for good behavior. And then there are the repeat offender laws, the three strikes laws, that can put somebody away for a very long time, even life, for what would otherwise have been a minor crime but happened to be the third felony. Excuse me. Other contributing factors that I think don't get nearly as much attention are the kinds of zero tolerance policies or sometimes called broken windows policies, most famously it used in New York, but elsewhere in the country. And these are policies that criminalize low-level kind of a criminal offending. So that the death in New York that we're all familiar with when, why am I forgetting his name, was selling loose cigarettes, is an example of that kind of zero tolerance, arresting turnstile jumpers, etc. That kind of policing has actually increased incarceration rates in jails, not in prisons obviously, but in jails quite dramatically. And then in low-level drug offending, so drug offending that at one time would have resulted in diversion or would have resulted in a fine, now is much more likely to result in incarceration. So you have this kind of net widening effect as well. Additional contributions to mass incarceration include Supreme Court decisions that have upheld a number of searches and seizures that many of us thought were quite questionable and should not have been upheld. I should have added to that Supreme Court decisions on equal protection, decisions that have allowed the police to use race as a factor in determining, for example, what motorists to stop. And then in addition to the 5-4 Supreme Court decisions that have changed policing and for the worse, you have this phenomenon of municipalities and courts funding what they do on the backs of poor defendants and their families. So what's happened is we've seen a tightening of public funds and then aggravated by the recent financial crisis. As a result, municipalities and courts are hungry for money. Legislatures are not providing it in the hands of courts. And so we have seen this dramatic increase in the number of fines, in the fees, et cetera, that are leveled at people who are charged with crimes or convicted of crimes. And then if they fail to pay, it can result in incarceration. We have, in fact, a debtor's prison. In addition to that, civil violations, for example, the failure to pay child support, can also result in incarceration as well. So Ferguson is a prime example of the use of the criminal justice system to fill the coffers of a municipality. If you haven't looked at the DOJ report on Ferguson, I strongly recommend that you do. It's truly shocking and distressing. In Ferguson in 2013 alone, the court issued over 9,000 warrants on cases that stemmed mostly from violations like parking infractions and housing code violations like forgetting to mow your yard. What happened in Ferguson is that this enforcement was concentrated again in an African American community, and the evidence that there were directives coming from the mayor's office directly to the chief of police saying you've got to get violations up because we're not going to make our budget were in the record and quite shocking. And what happened is that if people failed to show for a minor infraction, a warrant was issued and they faced jail time. Every time they failed to show or were unable to pay, then the penalties only ratcheted up. So in summary here, we have these different strands or these different strands that all come together to create hyper incarceration. Those are the increased length in sentencing, the diminishment of parole, the repeat offender statutes, that's one. Two, this increase in the kind of conduct that could land you in jail. We now criminalize things that would have in the past been civil infractions. We have a debtor's prison. That's the result of the ratcheting up of fines and then fees because one failed to pay the fines. And three, this impact has been dramatically felt by communities of color, but particularly African American communities. It is an impact that is not only raced, but is deeply classed. It is an impact that is felt primarily by individuals of color, and the drug war in particular has been focused on poor communities and poor communities of color. So those of us working to end gender violence, of course, are concerned about this massive growth in the state's control. As human rights and civil rights activists, we recognize our common cause with other justice organizations. But as I said at the outset, I think the direct connections to domestic violence are not always apparent, or if they are, we need a better way of describing them. We need a stronger vocabulary for explaining those links to our funders, to activists, to our supporters. So I'm going to turn now to some of the ways I think of making that link, and I do not mean to say that these are the only ones, but I think that these may be links that are not apparent to our larger stakeholders. So let me say at the beginning that the state, of course, is the perpetrator of some of the most significant forms of violence against women, and that much of that state perpetrated violence occurs through the criminal justice process. And in fact, what this slide should say, it's violence against women and men, and that the concerns about the ways in which the criminal justice system perpetuates and perpetrates violence against men is, of course, one of the concerns that we hear from survivors who are not interested in subjecting their abusive partner or ex-partner to that system, or who believe that it would be counterproductive. So I in no way mean to minimize or diminish the importance of that aspect of this discussion. I am going to turn, however, to a somewhat narrower conversation. I'm going to now turn to interpersonal violence and intimate partner violence in specific. So I'm going to talk about these following connections. I'm going to talk about 4 connections that are between domestic violence and mass incarceration or hyper incarceration. The 4 are these: the victimization connection, the economic connection, the neighborhood connection, and what I call the trauma connection. So I'll begin with the victimization connection. I think this is the one that is most well known. Policing and prosecution policies result in draconian sentences for victims of domestic violence whose criminal offending is a direct result of their victimization. This is a particular problem in drug crimes. We know that there are a larger percentage of the women in prison are there for drug offenses than is true for men. In large part, that's because men are much more likely to commit violent offenses than are women. But we also know anecdotally that a number of women in prison for drug offenses are there because they played minor roles. Sometimes they didn't play any role in a drug conspiracy that their abusive partner was a primary instigator. And we know, too, that there's a real problem in that with mandatory sentencing, particularly in the federal scheme, but also in many state schemes, that the kinds of protections that would have been available for women at an earlier date, in other words, the kinds of protections that would have lessened their sentence because they are primary caretakers of children, for example, are no longer available. And we know that conspiracy law and doctrine has broadened. so that one need do very precious little to become a co-conspirator. One needs to have done very little to be swept in. Simply being with a violent partner can make it very easy for a prosecution to prove conspiracy. And we know that under sentencing guidelines, reductions primarily come in two forms that might be relevant here. One is in cooperation with prosecution, and then the other is in the sentencing under duress. With regard to the cooperation, very frequently women play such minor roles they have little to trade, or what they do have to trade would put them and their families at very significant risk. And in terms of duress, the courts have been pretty hostile, not entirely so, but pretty hostile to duress claims, certainly in the guilt phase, but even in the sentencing phase. We also know that there continue to be problems with self-defense doctrine and with duress doctrine, I could have said here. So that when women defend themselves against a batterer, the intersections of race and class and gender and LGBT bias are frequently factors that prevent a fair hearing. So we know, for example, that women who fight back are not seen as real victims. We know that African American women in particular are likely to be viewed as not real victims, as being inherently violent, and there have been a number of studies by Victoria Nurse, for example, and Holly McGuigan looking at the trial court bias, finding that basic self-defense law is not applied in a fair way when the defendant is a woman who argues that she killed in response, or rather in self-defense with an abuser. So the second combination, or I'm sorry, the second connection between mass incarceration and domestic violence is what I call the economic connection. Hyper incarceration deepens poverty and deepens subjective economic strain. Both of those are correlated with significant increases in domestic violence. A conviction can have dramatic economic consequences. Someone who has a conviction may lose their occupational license. They may be ineligible for financial aid to go to school. They may lose public housing. They may lose welfare and eligibility for welfare and food stamps. If they are convicted of a sex offense, they may be subject to a lifetime sex offender registration requirement and a residency requirement. They may lose their right to vote. They may lose their driver's license. This slide's a little bit hard to read, so let me try to translate it. I think that these collateral consequences are fairly well known. I think people have a sense about this. This I'm not so sure. I mentioned this before, and this is the way in which debt accumulates throughout the criminal justice system. So in order, of course, to be represented by a public defender, you have to meet an income requirement. But many locales require an application fee to get a public defender. Many sentences include fines, restitution, as well as fees for court administrative costs, as well as for prosecution reimbursement fees. When on probation and parole, the parolee has to pay for his or her drug testing, for mandatory treatment, therapy, class fees, etc. And then every time one is late or fails to pay, there's interest, there are late fees, there are collection fees that attach. So the combination of the kinds of collateral consequences, and then on top of that, the combination of the incredible fees that can be racked up by criminal defendant have a devastating economic consequence. In addition to those two ways in which there are bad economic consequences to incarceration, there's a third I don't have a slide for, and that's what I would call prison profiteering. So you have many private companies that operate services within prisons that charge over-market fees for their services. So for example, services for telephone calls out, charging exorbitant fees for collect calls. There are prisons now that are going to using video conferencing for all of their prison visitation and charging the prisoner to pay for the video conferencing, again, at an over-market rate. When a prisoner comes in and empties his pockets and then the institution holds his money, there are prisons now that are giving the prisoner on release a debit card, and then a company, a bank, is charging him a fee to get back his own money. And then, of course, on top of that are the consequences to getting a job if one has a criminal record. Not just the consequences because of lack of licensing, etc., but because of the refusal of the marketplace to hire people who have jobs. So we see this kind of aggregate impact of incarceration, and we see that it has, and this is looking at men here obviously, but we see a dramatic impact on the earnings of someone who's been incarcerated. So why do I think that has something to do with domestic violence? Well, it's because significant research finds that poverty and economic strain are correlated with increases in male-on-female domestic violence in heterosexual households. So I'm looking here at the research of Michael Benson and Greer Fox. And what they found is that they did a comparison. They looked at research that had data from 1988 and then went back to the same couples in 1994. So it's a wave 1, wave 2 comparison. And what they found is that men who'd experienced a single episode of unemployment in that interval had domestic violence rates of 7.5% compared to those who had steady employment at 4.7%. But if the man had experienced more than 1, 2, or more periods of unemployment, that domestic violence rate jumped to 12.3%. They also found that couples who reported subjective feelings of financial strain, in other words, who answered positively to questions like, do you worry about money, also showed higher rates, significantly higher rates of domestic violence than did other couples. We see that this research, this connection between the income in the household and the economic prospects of the household and rates of domestic violence is repeated in many, many other research out there. I'll just mention one, and this is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It's relying on the National Crime Victimization Survey. And again, you see that when you're talking about female victims of intimate partner violence, you've got much higher rates here for women in households that had less than $7,500 average annual income. This, of course, is looking 2000 to 2005. All right, so the third connection between domestic violence and hyper incarceration is what I will call the neighborhood connection. It's going to take me a minute to sort of unpack this one. Because incarceration, particularly that related to drug enforcement, is geographically concentrated in low-income communities of color, the economic and social impact of that hyper incarceration is similarly concentrated. You remember that hyper incarceration is a racially and classed phenomenon, and the effects are racially and class based, and the same given our level of segregation in this country, both economic and racial, means that this kind of geographic concentration has an effect on communities. So when significant numbers of people who are in their prime years for child rearing and income producing are removed from communities, then their absence weakens the social fabric and social networks in the community and has an impact on the general community. So I want to try to unpack that in several ways. First, just as an example, a study of incarceration effects in New York City, for example, found that as incarceration worsened, as the rates of incarceration deepened, it had these kinds of cyclical kinds of effects in a community. Businesses didn't want to hire ex-inmates, and if there were a concentrated number of people returning from prison into that community, it stigmatized the community and deterred businesses from hiring locally or from even locating in that area at all. Two, the higher levels of incarceration meant that it gave police incentive and encouraged police to surveil that community even more. So a community that had a high level of incarceration, police were much more likely to go back to that community, were much more likely to look at the neighborhood residents with suspicion. It was much more likely to create higher levels of surveillance, and of course, particularly with drug crimes, as I said, the higher level of surveillance is likely to lead to higher levels of arrest and incarceration. Three, and this is not about, I'm sorry, those are the two from New York, but a third way in which hyperincarceration affects the community is that in those states that have felon disenfranchisement, like my state, it limits the political clout of neighborhoods that are already stigmatized. When you have significant numbers of individuals who are unable to vote, it weakens the political clout, the political power of everybody else. But there's an additional way in which hyperincarceration destroys neighborhoods, and for that I turn to the research of sociologists who look at social disorganization theory to understand. Hyperincarceration weakens neighborhoods, may weaken neighborhoods by weakening the social controls in the neighborhood and by weakening the social networks in the neighborhood. So as Dorothy Roberts notes here, the mass movement of adults between the neighborhood and the prison impedes the ability of families and other organizations to enforce social norms. Other research looks at the impact that mass incarceration has on weakening social networks. In poor communities, social networks, family and friend networks are critical for survival, As more people are removed from those networks, the networks fray. So one of the ways I think to think about this, and it's something that many of us understand, is that most of the men and women who are incarcerated are parents. Most of them are incarcerated at a time in which they have children in the home. One of the impacts of male incarceration is to diminish the financial capacity for the mothers who are left taking care of children. When women are incarcerated, when mothers are incarcerated, they are much more likely to have their children put into foster care because the kinds of networks that are needed to support those children are frayed and are less likely to exist. The fathers are less likely to be able to take responsibility for the children, or the state is less likely, perhaps more true, the state is less likely to see them as capable caregivers. All right, so why do I think this impact of hyperincarceration has a relationship to domestic violence? Well, I'm not aware of any research that looks specifically at the impact of hyperincarceration on communities and then tries to look at that effect on domestic violence. But there is research on the impact of multiple disadvantage, and put quotes around that, and rates of domestic violence that should raise concerns for us. So sociologists have for some time found higher rates of violent criminal offending in neighborhoods that are variously characterized, but I'll talk about them in terms of multiply disadvantaged or simply disadvantaged neighborhoods. Some sociologists have found support for believing that one of the reasons you see higher violent crime rates in such neighborhoods is that the social controls are weakened and the social networks are weakened. Benson and Fox, the researchers that I mentioned before in the employment context, compared rates of domestic violence in neighborhoods that were, according to using census data, that would fit a, quote, disadvantaged neighborhood, and compared that to more advantaged neighborhoods. What they found, you can see in this slide here, is that the disadvantaged neighborhoods had rates of domestic violence, and I want to remind you this is male on female, heterosexual. Rates of domestic violence that were more than twice what they were in the other neighborhoods. You see a similar kind of finding in the second research project down here at the bottom. Now, we've already established that poverty is a factor that correlates strongly with increased rates of domestic violence, and we've established that economic strain is a factor as well. So one might reasonably ask whether or not this is simply repeating those findings. In other words, is this just about the composition of the neighborhood? If you have more poor people, then you're going to see higher rates of domestic violence. Benson and Fox think not. They controlled for a whole set of factors that are known to be correlated with domestic violence and found that a significant amount of that increase between advantaged and disadvantaged could only be explained by neighborhood, by living in the neighborhood. There's a great deal of research on this, and not all of it supports these conclusions. There is a fair amount of research that does, and so I raise this as a concern for us to think about. And just finally, one more data point here that suggests, again, that neighborhood matters. Okay. There are other kinds of neighborhood effects that I don't have on my slide, and I want to just mention for a moment. Concentrated enforcement, hyper incarceration, I think raises the stakes for survivors who call the police. There's an increased likelihood in communities that are the subject of hyper incarceration that they or their partner or somebody in their household is under suspicion, has an outstanding warrant, or will be looked at suspiciously by the police. The national questionnaire that Sue told you about at the beginning, we researched, or rather we did survey research with service providers, advocates, and attorneys for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. We had more than 900 respondents. And one of the things that we heard from those respondents is that many of them had clients who feared calling the police because of their own criminal or drug histories, put them at risk for arrest. And I emphasize for non-domestic violence crimes. This is not the dual arrest problem for DV. This is a different problem. In fact, one respondent noted that the police in her area routinely ran a warrant search on any sex worker who complained of sexual assault. But we heard very similar kinds of things with women, about women who had drug histories. So another connection that I also wonder about and would like to hear your thoughts about, and that is whether or not hyper-incarceration doesn't deepen police bias. The concentrated enforcement in communities of color may increase the likelihood of individual police racial bias. Certainly it creates, it enhances the distrust of police, and I think it increases police misconduct, harassment, and violence as police increasingly see neighborhoods as their enemy and view neighborhood citizens with suspicion. We know, again, in terms of connections to domestic violence, that police bias is a substantial problem for survivors. I think one of the problems that we have in our in the way in which we talk about police bias is that we don't address the intersectionality issue as much as we might. Police bias, there are certainly sexist kinds of bias, but much of the bias that we saw in the survey is about bias against particular women, immigrant women, LGBT people, poor people in general, and poor women in particular, and we saw a significant number of respondents talk about bias against African American survivors. So thus far, I've talked about the victimization connection, the economic connection, and the neighborhood connection between hyper-incarceration and domestic violence. Excuse me. So the final connection that I want to talk about is the connection between the trauma or mental health connection. And this is particularly focused on the reentry problem. Prisons, of course, vary enormously in their brutality, but many prisons are hellholes. They are inhumane, they are violent, they are dangerous. A significant number of prisoners are exposed to traumatic events. Many of those who are exposed to traumatic events have experienced repeat trauma. We know that repeat trauma makes one more vulnerable to developing post-traumatic stress disorder. Research demonstrates that men who have post-traumatic stress disorder have higher rates of domestic violence commission. Much of the research that links PTSD with domestic violence on the part of men is looking at combat veterans diagnosed with PTSD, For example, one study found that a third of male veterans with PTSD engaged in intimate partner violence during the year prior to the study. Many other studies have found similarly strong kinds of connections. I have not found great research looking at former prisoners, and I have found high rates of PTSD research looking at former prisoners, but not that then makes that connection with domestic violence. There are, however, some reentry programs that are very much focused on that presumed connection. Violence in prison, of course, is a very significant problem. A study of New York City jail, 66% of inmate injuries were intentional. 15% of state prisoners surveyed by BJS reported violence-related injuries. Sexual assault in prison, of course, is significant as well, not nearly as significant as other kinds of physical assault, but significant. I've talked about this already, the likelihood of post-traumatic stress disorder, the link between men who experience PTSD and their likelihood of committing domestic violence. And the rates of PTSD for men who've been in prison. In addition to the increased risk for the perpetration of domestic violence that is likely flows from PTSD, Spirit, who's a law professor, has coined the term toxic masculinity to describe the kind of hyper-masculine space that develops in some male prisons. He says that it's a brutal form of masculinity inside that mirrors, but in a hyped-up way, dominant forms of masculinity outside. I note here that research on sexual assault shows that men who are identified as bisexual or gay are far more likely to be the victims of sexual assault. There is an extremely gendered way in which violence occurs in prison, both in terms of testing masculinity, defining masculinity, that likely, I have no proof of this, spills into relationships upon release. So to recap then, I've argued that hyper-incarceration makes it more likely that domestic violence survivors who engage in criminal offending, or even those who don't, but who, because of facing long prison sentences, plead guilty to something they didn't do, but makes it more likely that they will receive harsh and unfair sentences. I've argued that hyper-incarceration diminishes the economic prospects for formerly incarcerated individuals and their families, thereby increasing the risk for future domestic violence. I've argued that hyper-incarceration diminishes the economic viability of entire neighborhoods and likely diminishes the social controls and the social networks in targeted communities, which in turn likely increases the risk for male on female domestic violence. And finally, I've argued that incarceration, and I would note particularly long sentences, increases the risk of trauma exposure for prisoners, which in turn increases the risk for PTSD and other psychological reactions. These PTSD and other psychological reactions are also tied to the increased risk for male on female domestic violence. Finally, I've argued that hyper-incarceration may encourage police misconduct, give opportunities for the enactment of implicit racial bias, and further increase the risk for violence and hostile responses to domestic violence claims made by survivors, particularly for women of color, LGBT youth, immigrant women, poor women, Of course, all of these effects, I think, of mass incarceration are of critical importance to the work we do. I want to turn now to a larger perspective. I want to talk a little bit about what I call the big picture here, and think about the way in which hyper-incarceration might fit into a larger political frame. To do that, I'm going to borrow from the work of Jonathan Simon and the work of Beth Ritchie. So Simon talks about the concept of governing through crime. Simon's argument is that crime and forms of knowledge associated with crime have become the primary governing tools and the way to think about responses to all manner of social ills. So, for example, school misconduct, most of us are familiar with the concept of the school-to-prison pipeline. School misconduct moves from something to be controlled in the school system to something to be criminalized, literally criminalized. But on the other hand, there are other kinds of conduct that may not be literally criminalized, but that are responded to in harsh and punitive kinds of ways. The zero tolerance kind of language moves from the criminal system, criminal justice system, into other kinds of spaces as well. We have the literal criminalizing of minor welfare fraud, for example, but then we have, in addition to that, the very punitive kinds of responses to welfare recipients that treat them as criminals, even if not literally so. Similarly, Beth Ritchie talks about the prison nation, the U.S. as prison nation, meaning the ideological and public policy shifts that led to increased criminalization of disenfranchised communities of color, more aggressive law enforcement strategies for norm-violating behavior, and an undermining of the civil and human rights of marginalized groups. This massive investment of dollars and public resources into crime control policies happens at the same time as a massive disinvestment in communities, in welfare and education, in housing and jobs. As Dorothy Roberts here notes, this welfare, prison, foster care, and deportation systems, all of these systems that are operating in punitive, criminalizing fashion, regulate the very residents of the neighborhoods that are the most devastated by the withdrawal and complete diminishment of whatever existed of a welfare state. It's this larger, what I would call neoliberal frame that I think is important here to talk about. So what I mean by this larger neoliberal frame is an ideology and policies that rest on notions of extreme autonomy and individualism. There is no public and there's no public responsibility except for security. Trade and market are supreme. Government functions have been largely privatized and have been shrunk. Global economic policies allow for the free movement of capital but not labor. And the primary public investment, as I said, is in security, in defense, and in police, while at the same time there's been a dramatic diminishment in the welfare. So Karin Gustafsson's research looking at the way in which welfare policies have been literally criminalized and in which welfare recipients, poor people, are treated as criminals, I think is instructive here. So it's my view that those of us who are working to put an end to gender violence and who are working specifically on domestic violence and sexual assault need to join other social justice organizations who are resisting this neoliberal framework. We need to be focusing on changing structural inequalities and demanding investments in people, not in the criminal justice state. So, what does this mean for our work? So I have some ideas here, but I am very anxious to hear your comments. I will run through these and then I'll stop. But before that, I'm going to drink some more water. So I think one thing to do is to critically evaluate reliance on criminal remedies. So this is, as I said at the beginning, there are two strains to this talk. One has to do with what impact, if any, does this information, should it have, on how we do the work we do with survivors. And the other strain is, quite apart from that, how might we join forces with others to put an end to mass incarceration that affects survivors so dramatically and increases the risk for domestic violence so dramatically. So the first here has to do with the first strand of that, how we, what impact, if any, does this information have on what we do. So what I call for is a critical evaluation of reliance on criminal remedies, reviewing the extent to which criminal remedies are meeting the needs of survivors. In some communities, I think the apparatus of mandatory arrest, no-drop prosecution, and batterers intervention programs may serve, in fact, to increase state control, not only in the lives of abusers, but in the lives of survivors. That may not always be the case. That's why I think it's critical that each community engage in a critical evaluation with their membership and their stakeholders and the people they work with. Second, and more generally, as a movement, I think we need to challenge more the structural inequalities that create and maintain violence. We have put a tremendous amount of energy as a movement into changing the criminal justice system. But we have seen this incredible diminishment in the services and support for people, and we need to be at the front line of challenging that and demanding that we do better. Third, when we think about how to reform policing, I think we need a critical evaluation about how we engage in that reform. So now most programs around the country are a part of a council, a regular meeting of community services, as well as perhaps the prosecutor's office and the police department and the domestic violence or sexual assault liaison from the police department. In fact, when we did the national survey, we found that 63% of our respondents were aware of regular local meetings with service providers, and many of them believed those meetings to be useful. However, when we asked them if they were aware of other mechanisms of police oversight, civilian complaint review boards, etc., in their community, most were not. Only 28% knew if anything like that existed in their community. I don't mean to say that civilian complaint review boards and the like are some magical apparatus that would change everything. But it does, I think, point to a lack of awareness about ways of moving the police that are not engaged in dialogue with the police, but rather that come from outside pressure. It's no secret, of course, that federal dollars and have emphasized this kind of approach, this kind of collaborative kind of approach. But I wondered if it doesn't come at some cost. What we heard from many of the respondents in this survey was that while they thought these meetings were somewhat helpful, they also told us that they were very, very unhappy with police response. We did not hear from the majority of respondents a strong endorsement that things were great, that the police were moving in the direction that they thought. And I have to wonder if by giving up that political ground of being able to push the police from rather outside rather than inside, if there isn't some loss there. Similarly, working with activist organizations like Black Lives Matter and the really wonderful LGBTQ activism, particularly around street harassment of youth, I think are areas in which we might think about doing more coalition work. Similarly, I think we might think about joining other justice organizations that are organizing against mass incarceration and racially biased policing. Deborah Weissman, who's a law professor at UNC, highlights the absence of advocates for survivors of domestic violence in the critical efforts to stop New York City racial profiling. There were many players at the table when it came time to develop the remedies for changes in New York City policing. The absence of a strong contingent of advocates for survivors at that table is likely to make a big difference in terms of the way in which the police continue to interact with survivors. The other thing I would encourage is that we support legislation to end mass incarceration and to end racial profiling. So NNEDV and the National Task Force have both signed on in support of the Federal Smarter Sentencing Act. Unfortunately, as Weissman argues or notes, again, no such organization signed on in support of the End Racial Profiling Act, as far as I'm aware. But these are opportunities for us to make those connections in a very public way, and I commend NNEDV and the National Task Force for their support. Even if we believe that the combination of mandatory arrest or no drop or strong prosecution policies and batterers intervention programs are working, even if we think that it's the best response, I would encourage you to oppose increased criminalization remedies. Oppose legislation that seeks to increase the criminal penalties for domestic violence and sexual assault, thereby opening up the dialogue for why we don't believe that piling on more criminal remedies is going to make the difference that we seek to make. I would just note, I think most people may know this about the Department of Justice gender bias policing. They released guidance to law enforcement agencies in December on gender bias policing, and DOJ investigations in a number of locales have found that police engaged in systematic biased policing. Whether these kinds of DOJ investigations can provide support for community organizing around changes in police behavior that are not so tied to not so tied to mandatory policies that attempt to control police is something you may want to investigate. I would encourage us to think about ways of incorporating within our work with charged and incarcerated women and men, highlighting the connections between violent victimization and criminal conduct, as well as highlighting the importance of state-perpetrated violence. And finally, I would encourage us to investigate the use of alternatives. Investigate the use of restorative justice, transformative justice, and other alternative kinds of interventions. Again, turning to the findings in the national survey, we found that a number of respondents told us that survivors very frequently had goals that didn't well align with the criminal justice system, and I think most of us have had this experience. Some of that was because they feared the criminal justice system would be too long and traumatic. But for many, it was because they didn't seek punishment so much as relief, and because they feared losing control of the process. What else? So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn it over to Sue, and she's going to give me questions.
Donna, that was fabulous. Thank you so much, and you've been getting lots of great kudos in the chat box, and we have way more questions posed than we're going to be able to address now. So I was saying in the chat box that I would seriously ask you to consider doing a part 2. I mean, this has really generated a lot of discussion, and it's really exciting to me. So, and when I said I was seriously going to ask you to do a part 2, someone, a colleague chimed in, how about a part 3 as well? So I think you've really generated a huge number of questions, and let's try to answer a few of them. But before we do that, I just want to say, those of you who were chiming in with, here's some things we're trying in our community, and Noelle, you said that, and I think it was Shelley. If you guys send us information, like a little blurb or something, we can put that up on the Google Drive where the other materials are, so all of you can get to that and see what people are doing. So if you can send that to Dot or to me, that would be terrific, and we will post that information, and we can give you a heads up when we post new information as well. So it was interesting, Donna, because I have to say that when you started talking about poverty and domestic violence and social disorganization and domestic violence, I made a note to myself, like I flipped off and went over to my little screen to say, switched over, and I said, oh, we're going to really need to talk about the discomfort that this brings up for those of us in the anti-domestic violence world. And by the time I got back to the chat box, there were about 14 comments. So I think, that's a touchstone for us because, I mean, as you know, in the anti-domestic violence world, a lot of what people talk about is, this is really something that crosses all classes, all races, all economic classes. And so, I think it's complicated because then there was like kind of people saying, yeah, how Donna's describing this would be okay, but we're sort of concerned about people getting out and other people saying, oh, poor people commit domestic violence at a much higher rate. So I'm just wondering if you could help us figure out a way of talking about that. And Sujata, I think what you said was a really important comment about that Donna was not making a linear causal argument, but so we need help. And it was definitely a touchstone. There was heat.
Right. Well, and I will, yes. I appreciate that it's a touchstone. And I appreciate that there are real risks involved. But so let me just say this. There is I'm forgetting who originally said that, but Jim Patajic has written about this quite well. This idea of universal risk. And basically what Jim says is that we moved from a place in which domestic violence was understood to be only committed by poor people. And in response to that, made a political move for universal risk, meaning it can happen to everybody, it can happen to your mother, it can happen to anybody, and that both of those points in that continuum are incorrect in the sense that, yes, of course, it happens across all those class lines, but in terms of risk, in terms of the likelihood, it's very clear that there's a class dimension to the likelihood. And similarly to what Kim Crenshaw said years and years ago about hiding racial information, I think that it has not served the movement and it has not served survivors well to hide that information. And here's why. I think if you don't understand that, then when you build a program, when you think about an intervention, you will not address the issues that are particularly salient for the women who are at the greatest risk and who have the least resources and who are also simultaneously at the greatest risk of the state's social control. And so those women are sandwiched between those two risks, and if we hide that fact, then we don't develop the policies that will dismantle those risks. Does that make sense, Sue?
It makes sense to me. And I really do think it's something that I would like to come back to because there are a lot of questions about it, and I feel like we have a lot to talk about there. So I really would like to revisit that.
Let me just say too, I think there is a question about communication, and there's a question, the political dimension of this is incredibly significant. And I think thinking about how to have this conversation in a way that is politically viable, that doesn't hide the truth and the risk, I think is the key. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay. And there's also been some questions about wanting to talk about alternatives and what does restorative and transformative justice look like for survivors. So I think that's like another 2 webinars, and there's other people on this, participants on this who can help with that. So it's just, there's hunger. I mean, and it's really, really exciting to me that there are people are so hungry. And I have 2 other questions, and one of them was that I'll ask now. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get to all the questions. Like I said, we will really talk with Donna about coming back and talking with us further. And I'll also send her the questions, and we'll figure out if there's a way that we can answer some of them and get them up on the Google Drive. One of the questions was if you know about any studies that show that survivors live with their intimate partner violence because they are afraid of CPS involvement or being charged with failure to protect, or charged with anything else, I would add. Have any studies shown the degree to which survivors choose not to report crimes to the criminal legal system for that reason? Do you know, Donna? I don't.
Yes. Well, I mean, our survey, which of course is all secondary, right? So we're getting reports from people who work with survivors. And what they told us was that there were several reasons, really primary reasons why women did not call the police, and one of the biggest ones was child protection. They were very afraid that calling the police would mean losing their children. So I don't know, other than, I think there is other empirical work out there. Well, actually, there was yes. Okay, I'll answer the question. Yes, I do. And I'll find it for you.
And
there was a research project in New York as well, right, that I looked at some time ago. You know who else has looked at this is Dorothy Roberts. Her focus is not limited to domestic violence, but she's done a series of interviews of women who are involved with child welfare. So, yeah. So first answer, look at our survey, and yes, there is support there. Second answer is let me look, and I think I can find more.
And I think some of the questions about over-surveillance in disadvantaged communities and of disadvantaged communities, Sandy and others who talked about that, I think that Donna came around and talked about that a little further, so I hope that got answered for you, about the impact of over-surveillance in those communities on higher rates of arrest and incarceration. I think you did answer that. So this is the last question because we are coming to the end of our time together. That I'm going to be able to ask today. So I'm sorry again for those of you who asked questions that we were not able to answer, but like I said, we'll try to figure out a way of addressing some of them either online or in another webinar. But this I thought was an interesting question, as were others as well. But do you think that the nonprofit industrial complex and the punitive mechanisms within the systems previously mentioned are exacerbating the obstacles for victims of DV and SA?
Wow. Okay. Do I think that the nonprofit systems and the punitive systems, is that the question?
Yes. As I understand it, yes. There's an and in there.
Right. So you're wanting me to take on the nonprofit industrial complex too. Thanks.
In 30 seconds, yes.
Well, I'm going to come at this in a way that's not going to satisfy this questioner. I think that that VAWA funding, which is a primary source, not the only. I mean, I know there are state funds as well, and there are private nonprofit grant funds as well. But I think the federal funds in particular have been focused, not entirely, but largely, on enhancing the criminal justice system. And I think that VAWA has had a tremendous impact in terms of what services and the movement has done. I think that the funding has really acted. I don't mean just the funding, but largely the funding has acted to limit our imagination, to limit our political muscle, and to limit our reach in terms of how we strategize and build coalitions with justice movements. So I am of course aware of very much aware of the critique of the nonprofit industrial complex, and for those of you not aware, I would very much encourage you to read the Insight book on the same, INCITE. And I think that I am. I don't imagine a world in which, at this moment, we could be offering the kinds of services that I think are needed without nonprofit support. I don't think that we have that capacity yet within communities. But I do think that criminalization focus and zero tolerance focus has captured much of that world, as well as certainly has totally captured the public funds.
And the good news is that both the many people in that nonprofit world and people in the OVW world and other federal partners are really interested in exploring the very issues that we talked about today. So I feel like we're at a really interesting and I feel hopeful moment where there's a lot of people really trying to figure out where do we go next. And Donna, really, we do need to end, but I really want to thank you for your leadership on this. And the information was just extraordinarily valuable and very well presented, and it's just going to be so helpful to so many of us. And I'm going to call you right after we hang up to try to schedule another time.
Well, thank you. And Sue, if I can just say, I share that optimism as well. There's so much movement happening across the country. It's very, very exciting, and I appreciate your leadership in that regard. And thank you to everybody.
And thank you to everybody who participated today. And I'm serious when I say to be continued. So thank you, Donna, and thank you all. And Donna, I really will call you, okay?
Okay.
You in your office?
I am.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.